Welcome to Dreamscribe, your companion on the journey to peaceful sleep. Before you drift off, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps this calming community grow. Where in the world are you tuning in from? Arrival at the RV park. I should have trusted my gut. The moment I pulled into Whispering Pines RV park, something felt off. Not in an obvious, in-your-face kind of way, but like walking into a room right after an argument. The air felt thick, heavy, too quiet. The place was old, like it had been left behind while the rest of the world moved on. The road leading in was cracked and faded, with weeds sprouting between tire ruts. The wooden welcome sign, Whispering Pines RV Park, open 24/7, was warped and splintering, the paint peeling so badly it looked like claw marks. But hey, it was cheap. I had been driving for hours, and my eyes felt like sandpaper. I just needed a place to park the RV, get some rest, and move on. Whispering Pines was the only sight for miles, and Google claimed it was peaceful and secluded. At that moment, peace and seclusion sounded great. As I pulled into the main lot, I spotted the check-in office. A small wooden cabin with a flickering porch light, dark windows, and a single locked door. But the thing that made me hesitate? The sound. A low, crackling static. It came from inside the office, muffled through the door. A radio, I assumed. Maybe a weather broadcast, maybe music, but there was no rhythm. No words. Just pure, unrelenting static. I stepped out of the RV, stretching my stiff legs. The place was empty. No cars in the lot. No other guests at check-in. No sign of a staff member. Then I noticed something else. A handwritten sign taped to the office door. Campers, choose any spot and leave payment in Dropbox. No name. No contact info. Just that. That wasn't normal. RV parks had staff, right? Someone to keep things running, someone to check people in. But the blinds were drawn, the door was locked, and the radio inside kept playing. I knocked once. Nothing. Knocked again, harder. No answer. Just the static. All right, I muttered to myself, brushing off the unease. I was overthinking. Maybe the owner was out running errands. Maybe they just left the radio on for company. Either way, I was too tired to care. Too settling in. I picked a spot near the tree line, backing my RV into a clearing with a picnic table and fire pit. It was perfect. Private, quiet, just what I needed. Or so I thought. The moment I turned off the engine, I heard it again. The static. It was faint now, carried on the wind. But it was constant, like it was following me. I stood there for a second, rubbing the back of my neck, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It was just a damn radio, probably a bad frequency. I focused on unpacking, setting up, getting comfortable. The routine helped push the weirdness aside, and by the time I finished, the sky was a deep navy blue. 3. Night falls, the static grows. As the sun dipped below the trees, the atmosphere changed. The woods felt darker than they should have. Not just in the way night normally falls, but like the trees were leaning in. The air was heavy with the smell of damp pine, but underneath it, something else. Something metallic. I shook it off, grabbing a beer from the mini fridge and settling into my camp chair. I was determined to relax. And for a while I did. The stars were out, the cool night air was refreshing, and the silence, apart from the occasional chirp of crickets, was peaceful. Until the static changed. It wasn't just a background hum anymore. It was louder, sharper. I frowned, tilting my head. It wasn't coming from the office anymore. It was coming from inside my RV. I stood up fast, nearly knocking over my beer. My heart thumped against my ribs as I stepped toward the RV door. My radio was off. My phone was on silent. So why was I hearing static? Swallowing hard, I stepped inside, flipping on the overhead light. The sound immediately cut off. The silence was deafening. I stood there waiting, listening. Nothing. My hands felt clammy as I checked the radio. It wasn't even plugged in. My phone. Still silent. I let out a shaky laugh, running a hand through my hair. Maybe I was just exhausted. Maybe it was some weird acoustic trick, the wind carrying the sound. I forced myself to relax, locking up for the night and crawling into bed. 4. First unsettling moment. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing I remember is waking up to complete silence. No crickets. No wind. Just an unnatural, suffocating stillness. I sat up, heart pounding. I had no idea what woke me up, but my gut was screaming at me that something was wrong. Then, a click. A small, soft sound, like a radio dial turning. And then, the static. Louder this time. So loud it made my ears ring. It was inside the RV again, but I had unplugged the radio. Hadn't I? I turned toward the kitchenette, barely able to breathe, and froze, because sitting on the counter, where there had been nothing before, was an old radio, a bulky 1970s style model, the kind with knobs instead of buttons, and it was playing, full blast. 5, a warning? I bolted out of bed, grabbing the radio with shaking hands. It was ice cold. The static crackled, popped, shifted. Then, just for a second, a voice, distorted, faint, almost buried in the noise. Don't open the door. And then, silence. The radio turned itself off. I stood there, frozen, my pulse hammering in my throat. My stomach twisted into knots. I wanted to throw the damn thing out the window, but something told me not to touch it. A warning. That's what it felt like. But don't open what door? The RV door? Or, my breath caught in my chest as I remembered something. The check-in office. The back room. I hadn't seen a back door. But what if there was one? What if it was still locked? And what if something was inside? A restless night. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed, my body exhausted but my mind racing. The radio, the voice, the warning. It all looped through my head, over and over, refusing to let go. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I could still hear it. That low, crackling hum of static, buried beneath the silence. At some point, I must have dozed off because I jolted awake to something soft, subtle, a whisper, right outside the RV. I held my breath, every muscle locking up. It wasn't wind, not an animal. It was murmuring, faint, garbled, like a radio signal barely coming through. The hairs on my arms stood straight up. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. The blinds were closed, but I could see just a sliver of the outside through the edge. And in that sliver, something moved. A shadow. I shot upright, heart hammering. I scrambled to the front of the RV, throwing the curtains wide. Nothing. The campsite was still. No movement. No footprints. Just the distant glow of the check-in office porch light, flickering weakly against the dark. And in the stillness, just beneath the wind, the static was back. The office door, a change in the static. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the sun finally rose, I forced myself out of the RV, trying to shake off the eerie feeling in my chest. I wasn't going to sit here and let my imagination get the best of me. I needed answers. The check-in office was still locked when I got there, the same handwritten note taped to the door. Campers, choose any spot and leave payment in Dropbox. But something was different this time. The static was gone. I frowned, pressing my ear against the wood. Silence, like the radio had finally been shut off. I knocked again. Hello? Nothing. I bent down, trying to peek through a gap in the blinds. The inside was dark, but I could make out dusty furniture, a counter, a few filing cabinets. Then something caught my eye. In the far corner of the office, behind the desk, was a door. A door I hadn't noticed before. It was small, blending almost seamlessly into the wooden walls. And the more I stared at it, the more my stomach twisted. That door didn't belong. It felt wrong. Other campers, but no staff. I needed a distraction, something normal. So, I decided to do a lap around the park, see if there were any other campers. Maybe they'd noticed something weird too. And sure enough, I wasn't alone. There were about half a dozen RVs and campers scattered throughout the park. An elderly couple was sitting outside theirs, drinking coffee. A man in a flannel shirt was unloading firewood from his truck. I exhaled in relief. Okay, normal people. That was a good sign. I walked over to the couple first. Morning, I said. You guys know who runs this place? The office is locked. The old woman shook her head. Never met them. We've been coming here for years, though. Always the same deal. Leave your payment and pick a spot. That felt impossible. No staff at all? I pressed. Nope, the old man chimed in, sipping his coffee. Used to be, but not anymore. I frowned. Then who maintains the place? The woman just shrugged. Don't know, honey, but it's a nice park, isn't it? I forced a nod. Yeah, sure. But inside, my skin was crawling. The whispering woods. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to convince myself that everything was fine. The radio was just an old signal. The voice was just my imagination. But the feeling that something was watching me never left. By sunset, I was restless. I needed to walk, clear my head. So, I headed toward the hiking trail that wound through the woods behind the RV park. The trees were thick and gnarled, their branches stretching overhead like skeletal fingers. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. Until, whispering, faint, crackling like a badly tuned station. I froze. The whispering wasn't coming from behind me. It was coming from inside the woods. I turned slowly, my pulse hammering. The trees swayed, their shadows stretching long against the forest floor. And then, a shape, standing just at the edge of my vision. I blinked, and it was gone. No, I saw something. I swallowed hard, every instinct screaming at me to leave. I turned and bolted back toward the RV park. Nightfall, the static returns. That night, I locked the RV door. Double-checked it, triple-checked it, and then I did something I never do. I closed every curtain. I didn't want to see what was outside. By midnight, I was still wide awake, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding with every tiny sound. Then, click, the static roared to life. I sat up so fast I nearly fell out of bed. It was coming from the kitchenette, from the same radio as before. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even looked at it all day. But there it was, turned on, crackling. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move closer. My fingers trembled as I reached for the knob. The moment I touched it, the static shifted, and through the noise, a voice whispered, "The door is open." My stomach dropped. I spun toward the RV door. My breath caught in my throat. The deadbolt was unlocked. I had locked it. I knew I had locked it. And yet, the door was slightly open, a thin sliver of darkness stretching between the frame. I could feel something on the other side, watching me. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, the sound of a radio turning off. A single click, and the RV went completely, deathly silent. A hollow knock. I barely slept. The sound of the radio static, the whispering voice, the unlocked door, they kept replaying in my head, looping like a broken transmission. By morning, I was running on pure adrenaline. I had to check the office again. I walked fast, my breath fogging in the crisp air. The sun had barely risen, and most of the campers were still asleep. When I reached the check-in office, the static had returned. Faint but unmistakable. A low, pulsing hum coming from inside. I knocked. "Hello?" No answer. I knocked again, harder. The static flickered. For a fraction of a second, it cut out completely. Then a hollow knock echoed back. From inside, I stumbled backward, my heart slamming into my ribs. No one was in there. But I had knocked twice, and something inside had answered with 2 knocks. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. Then, I bent down and peeked through the gap in the blinds. The door inside the office, the one I hadn't noticed before. It was open, not fully, just an inch. A thin sliver of darkness stretched between the frame, and for a single, horrible moment, I thought I saw something move inside it. A campground that doesn't change. I ran. I didn't care if I looked crazy. I needed space. I needed air. By the time I reached my RV, my hands were shaking so bad I had to sit down. Deep breaths. Deep breaths. What the hell was going on? I grabbed my phone, ready to look up anything about this place. Local history, old news articles, paranormal reports, something. But when I pulled up Google Maps, my stomach dropped. The RV park wasn't listed. Not just the office, the entire campground. The satellite image showed dense forest where the park should have been. No sign of roads, no cleared out lots. It didn't exist. I checked my location again, refreshed the page, closed and reopened the app. Nothing. My campsite wasn't supposed to be here. The old campers. I needed answers. I stormed over to the older couple's RV, the ones who said they'd been coming here for years. I knocked hard, and after a long pause, the door creaked open. The old woman peered out at me, her kind face lined with concern. "You okay, honey?" I exhaled, trying to steady my voice. "How long have you been coming here?" She blinked. "Oh, a long time. Since before my husband retired." "How long ago was that?" She hesitated. "Too long." Then softly, I'm not sure." A cold weight settled in my chest. "What year is it?" I pressed. She frowned. "Why, She stopped. The crease in her brow deepened. I waited. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Finally, she laughed. But it was shaky, forced. "Lord, I must be more tired than I thought," she muttered. "Let me ask my husband." She turned, but he was already standing behind her. I hadn't even heard him move. "We should leave," he said. His voice was flat, final, and something about the way he said it made my blood run cold. His wife frowned. "But dear, we just got here. We should leave." He wasn't looking at me. He was looking past me, over my shoulder. I didn't turn. I couldn't. The glitching campsite. I practically sprinted back to my RV. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. I needed to leave. Now. I grabbed my keys, jammed them into the ignition. The RV didn't start. I tried again. And again. Nothing. Not even a click. The office door finally opened. The air felt heavier, thicker, like the sky had pressed down on the entire RV park. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, keys trembling in my grip. My RV wasn't starting. I had tried everything, turning the key, checking the battery, even stepping outside to look under the hood. Nothing. And now, sitting in the eerie quiet, I realized something even worse. The static was back. Louder. Not just coming from the check-in office anymore. It was everywhere. Hissing through the trees. Buzzing through the air itself. A low, droning hum that made my skin crawl. And then, a click. From across the lot, the check-in office door swung open. All on its own. A room that shouldn't exist. I forced myself to move. Every instinct told me not to go near that door. But at this point, I had no choice. The RV wasn't starting. I was trapped, and I needed to know what was inside that office. I stepped forward, every muscle in my body screaming turn around. The static rose. The closer I got, the worse it became. By the time I reached the doorway, the sound was deafening, like thousands of voices whispering over each other, overlapping into pure noise. I peered inside. The front desk looked the same. The lamp still flickered. But now the back door, the one I had seen cracked open, was fully ajar. A black void yawned beyond it. And then, from deep inside the darkness, a voice. Faint, garbled. A woman's voice. Hello? A voice from nowhere. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that no one had been inside this office. And yet, the voice had come from beyond that door. I hesitated, my heart slamming against my ribs. Hello? Closer. I wanted to run. I wanted to run more than I'd ever wanted anything in my life. But my feet carried me forward. The back door led to a staircase. A long, narrow staircase, descending downward. There was no way this place had a basement. I would have seen the foundation, the structure. There was no room for a basement under this tiny office. But the stairs were there, and the voice was coming from below. I took the first step. The static faded. The room below. Step by step, I moved deeper. The stairs were cold beneath my feet. The walls on either side were too smooth, too perfect, as if they weren't made of wood or stone, but something else entirely. The space smelled wrong. Like old dust and something metallic, something sharp. At the bottom, I reached another door. It was wooden, heavy, and when I pushed it open, I stepped into a room that shouldn't exist. It was massive, much larger than the office above. Rows of old televisions and radios lined the walls, their screens flickering with static and distorted images. Some played grainy security footage of the RV park, but the timestamp was wrong. It wasn't from today. It wasn't even from this decade. The screen closest to me read, June 17th, 1986. The people on the screens. The footage was old, grainy, yellowed like an aging photograph. It showed the RV park, but something was off. The campers were wrong. Their clothes looked outdated, like they belonged to another era, and their faces were blurry, distorted, like the signal couldn't quite hold them in place. I scanned the monitors, my pulse pounding. Some of them showed the old couple, sitting outside their RV, just like I'd seen them yesterday. But the timestamp, it was from over 30 years ago. I turned to another screen. The image was barely visible through the static. A woman, sitting behind the check-in desk, her face obscured. The woman in the static. The grainy footage flickered on the old monitors, casting eerie, shifting light around the impossible basement. The woman at the check-in desk sat unnaturally still. Her face was blurred, shifting like a corrupted video file, but something about her posture, ***, rigid, wrong, unnatural, ***, sent a deep, primal fear down my spine. Then her head twitched. Once, twice, and then she turned. She was looking at me, through the screen. I stumbled backward, knocking into one of the old radios. The static from the speakers surged, louder, layered with distorted whispers. I turned to run. Don't go! The voice wasn't from the screen. It was right behind me, a memory that wasn't mine. I spun around. No one was there, but the whisper had been so close, like someone had been breathing against my ear. Then something shifted. The air in the room felt different. Heavier. like the moment before a thunderstorm. And then, a new video crackled to life on the largest monitor. The timestamp. Today. The footage showed the check-in office just minutes ago. I saw myself walk through the door. I saw myself step toward the back office. And then, I saw myself go down the stairs. This wasn't possible. The footage was being recorded in real time, but from an angle that didn't exist. And then, the screen glitched. For a split second, the woman behind the desk wasn't there anymore. I was, sitting in her place, staring straight at the camera. The radio that called my name. I backed away, my breathing ragged. The static from the old radios rose to a deafening screech. Then one of them cut through. A single voice. Familiar. My voice. Hello. My stomach twisted. That was me. It was my own voice, looping back through the static. I grabbed the nearest radio, twisting the dial, my fingers slick with sweat. The voice warped, fragmented, broken. Then, a different voice. A woman's. He's still watching. Crack. The radio shattered apart in my hands, the static surging through the room like a living thing. I turned, running for the staircase, the exit that no longer existed. I sprinted up the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the too tight walls. I reached for the doorknob at the top, but the second I touched it, the light flickered, and the door wasn't there anymore. Just a smooth, unbroken wall, like it had never been there at all. I pounded against it, heart hammering. No, 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 and no. The static was rising again. The whispering voices closer now. A shape moved in the dark below. Something coming up the stairs. The woman in the chair. The air around me distorted, crackling like a warped VHS tape. Then the room shifted. I wasn't at the staircase anymore. I was sitting behind the check-in desk. I couldn't move. I tried to stand, tried to scream, but my body didn't respond. I was frozen. And then, the bell at the front counter rang. The door swung open. Someone walked in. Me. I watched, trapped inside my own body, as I saw myself step forward. I reached toward the back office door. I watched myself go inside. The static rose to a shriek. And then, everything cut to black. The new camper. Hey man, you okay? The voice startled me. I blinked. I was outside. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows over the RV park. A man stood in front of me, frowning. You zoned out for a second, he said. I turned, confused, my heart still racing. I was standing by the check-in office, but something was wrong. I felt lighter, like something had been lifted from me. I looked at the office door. It was closed, sealed shut. A cold realization crept over me. The man was still watching me, brow furrowed. You work here or something? He asked. I opened my mouth and heard a voice that wasn't mine. Yeah, I said, just checking someone in. I didn't say that, but my mouth did. The man grinned. Cool. I just pulled in with my RV. Where do I sign? I watched helpless, trapped in my own skin, as my hands slid the check-in log toward him. He signed his name, and in the distance, the static began again. Next story. The long road stretched ahead, endless and unbroken, the fading sun bleeding orange and purple across the horizon. I had been driving for hours, my hands stiff on the wheel, my eyelids heavy. The isolation of the highway had weighed on me, making me eager to find a place to rest. According to my map, there was an RV park up ahead, Willow Pines Campground. It wasn't my first choice, but I was exhausted, and it was the only spot for miles. The entrance was barely marked, a rusted sign that swayed slightly in the breeze, its lettering faded. I pulled into the gravel lot and let out a breath. The place was small, nestled between tall pines that cast long, spindly shadows across the parked RVs. A few campers were scattered across the grounds, their windows dark, their porches eerily still. The check-in office sat at the far end of the lot, its porch light flickering as if struggling to stay alive. I killed the engine, the silence pressing in around me. Something about the place felt off, not overtly dangerous, but as if I had stepped into a space that wasn't entirely abandoned, yet not entirely lived in either. Shaking off the unease, I climbed out of my RV and approached the office. As I reached for the doorknob, the door swung open before I even touched it. A man stood in the doorway, smiling. You must be Ethan. He said my name before I could speak it. I frowned. Yeah, how did you? Oh, I always know. His smile widened, revealing teeth just a shade too white, too uniform. Welcome to Willow Pines. I'm Mr. Grayson, the manager. A chill crept up my spine. Maybe he had seen my reservation in the system. Maybe he had glanced at my license plate and somehow pulled my information. But something about the way he said it, with such certainty, unsettled me. I forced a smile and nodded. Right. I just need a spot for the night. Mr. Grayson stepped aside, motioning me in. Of course. I've already picked the perfect spot for you. I hesitated before stepping inside. The office was unnervingly neat. Not a single speck of dust on the counter, not a paper out of place. It smelled faintly of pine, and something else, something metallic, like old coins. Cash or card? He asked. I reached for my wallet. Card. He took it with careful fingers, swiping it through an old-fashioned reader. Your spot is lot 6. Just far enough from the others for some privacy, but close enough if you need company. Something in the way he said privacy made my skin prickle. Sounds good. He handed back my card, but before I could put it away, he tilted his head and said, How was the drive from Ironwood? I froze. My stomach nodded. I hadn't told him where I had been driving from. How did you? Oh, just a guess, he said with a casual wave of his hand. You seem like an Ironwood kind of guy. I forced a laugh, but my hands felt clammy. Yeah, I guess. I grabbed the key and muttered a quick thank you before stepping outside. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. I made my way back to my RV, shaking my head. It's nothing, just a coincidence. But it didn't feel like a coincidence. I parked at lot 6, turning off the engine and rubbing my eyes. The spot was nice enough, a fire pit, a picnic table, and a small clearing beyond the trees. It should have felt peaceful, but the weight of the manager's words lingered in my mind. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he had seen my license plate. Maybe he was just good at reading people. But then there were the other campers. As I locked up my RV and took a short walk around the grounds, I noticed something odd. The few people staying here moved differently, cautiously, like they were afraid to be seen. A woman sitting outside her RV barely glanced at me, her eyes flicking toward the office before quickly looking away. A man at another lot was hastily packing up his things, his hands shaking as he rolled up a power cord. I stopped near the communal showers, debating whether to ask someone about the manager. But before I could, the man packing up caught my eye. He hesitated, then muttered under his breath, Don't tell him anything. I turned fully to face him. What? He shook his head. Just don't talk too much. Don't let him know anything. He already knows enough. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I wanted to ask him more, but he was already climbing into his truck, speeding off before I could process what he had said. The first night, the manager's watchful eye. That night, I sat outside my RV, staring into the campfire. The flames flickered, casting long shadows that stretched toward the trees. Every few minutes, I caught myself glancing toward the office, half expecting to see Grayson standing there. At some point, I convinced myself I was being ridiculous. I went inside, locked my doors, and crawled into bed. I was drifting off when something made my eyes snap open. A soft crunch outside. Footsteps on gravel. I held my breath. The sound moved closer, slow, deliberate. I turned onto my side, peering out the small window near my bed. A figure stood outside my RV. My stomach turned to ice. It was Mr. Grayson. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. I stayed frozen in place, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then, as if sensing I was awake, he smiled. Not a friendly smile, a knowing one. I scrambled backward, knocking over a bottle of water. The noise was loud in the silence, but I didn't care. I reached for my phone, my breath coming in short gasps. By the time I looked back at the window, he was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Final thought before the next day. Morning came sluggishly, the sunlight barely cutting through the fog that had settled over the campground. I stepped outside, heart still hammering from the night before. The other campers were moving about, but no one looked me in the eye. The woman who had avoided me yesterday was gone. Her RV was still there, her camping chair still open, but there was no trace of her. It was like she had just disappeared. I made my way toward the office, determined to get answers. But as I reached for the doorknob, my stomach dropped. It was already open, and inside, sitting at the desk, waiting for me was Mr. Grayson. He smiled. I was wondering when you'd come back, he said. I already knew you would. The sense of unease that had settled over me during my first encounter with Mr. Grayson only deepened as the night wore on. It wasn't just the way he had spoken as if he knew me, but the casual, matter-of-fact way he mentioned details about my past. Things I had never told a soul at this RV park. At first, I tried to brush it off. Maybe I had mentioned something during check-in and had forgotten. Maybe he had looked me up online, though that thought wasn't any less disturbing. Yet, the way he spoke, as if he had known me for years, gnawed at the back of my mind. I locked the RV door that night, double-checked the latches, and even covered the small window above the sink with a towel. I wasn't sure why I felt so paranoid, but the feeling didn't fade. The air was heavy with silence, save for the occasional rustling of leaves outside. Somewhere in the distance, an owl let out a low, mournful hoot. I climbed into bed, my thoughts circling like vultures. I tried to remember if I had mentioned anything about my past when I checked in. Had I let something slip in conversation? It was possible. And yet, something about Grayson's demeanor didn't sit right. It was as if he wasn't recalling something I had told him, but rather something he had always known. I barely slept. Morning came sluggishly, the sky a pale wash of orange and blue. I rolled out of bed, groggy and uneasy. The park was unnervingly quiet, the usual morning bustle absent. No one seemed to be outside their RVs. The few other campers I had seen the night before had either left early or weren't the type to enjoy a cup of coffee by the picnic tables. Needing some fresh air, I stepped outside. The office stood at the far end of the park, its dark windows giving no hint of life inside. I turned my attention to the picnic area. There was an old man sitting at one of the wooden tables, staring off toward the trees. His posture was stiff, and his hands rested flat on the weathered surface of the table. Something about him struck me as odd, though I couldn't put my finger on it. "Morning," I greeted as I walked past, but he didn't respond. He didn't even blink. A chill ran through me, but I shook it off and continued toward the office. I needed answers. As I approached, I saw that the door was slightly ajar. I hesitated. The office had been locked last night. Had someone broken in? Cautiously, I pushed the door open. The musty scent of paper and old wood filled my nostrils. The inside was dim, lit only by the streaks of light slipping through the dusty blinds. A single desk sat in the middle of the room, cluttered with paperwork, a ledger, and a rotary phone that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. But what sent a shudder down my spine was the wall behind the desk. Rows upon rows of Polaroid photographs covered the surface. Each one showed a different guest, standing in front of their RV. Some were recent, their images still crisp and bright, while others had faded to sepia tones. And then I saw it. My picture. There I was, standing in front of my RV, wearing the same clothes I had on yesterday. I hadn't posed for this. I hadn't taken this picture. Cold dread settled in my stomach. My fingers trembled as I reached out to pull the photo from the wall. As I did, another one caught my eye. A photo of a man in an old flannel shirt, leaning against a rusted RV. It was the old man from the picnic table. Only the date on the photo read 1983. A sharp creak sounded behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. Mr. Grayson stood in the doorway, his expression as calm as ever. He looked at the photo in my hand, then back at me. "You shouldn't be in here," he said quietly. I swallowed hard, stepping back toward the desk. How do you have these?" He sighed, walking toward the desk as if we were discussing a mundane issue, like a misplaced reservation. "I keep records of everyone who stays here," he said simply. I clenched my jaw. "That doesn't explain why there's a picture of me, one I never took." Mr. Grayson didn't blink. "You've stayed here before." I felt like the floor beneath me was tilting. "That's not possible. I've never been here before yesterday." A long silence stretched between us. Then, with eerie calm, he reached into the desk drawer and pulled out an old guest book. He flipped through the yellowed pages before turning it around to face me. There, scrawled in faded ink, was my name. The date? 10 years ago. I staggered back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. This was a joke. It had to be a joke. But deep in my gut, I knew it wasn't. I had no memory of ever staying here before. And yet, my handwriting was right there, clear as day. My vision blurred. My head spun. "Why don't you sit down?" Mr. Grayson offered, gesturing to the chair across from the desk. I shook my head. I needed to get out of there. I needed to leave this RV park now. I turned and bolted for the door. The moment I stepped outside, the world felt wrong. The sky was an unnatural shade of gray. The trees in the distance seemed to ripple, as if they were painted on a canvas and someone had dragged their fingers across them. And the old man at the picnic table? Gone. I rushed back to my RV, my pulse a frantic drumbeat in my ears. I fumbled with the keys, nearly dropping them as I unlocked the door and scrambled inside. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the ignition to turn. The engine sputtered to life. I looked up at the rearview mirror. Mr. Grayson stood in the middle of the road, watching me. His hands were folded behind his back, his expression unreadable. Then ever so slowly, he raised one hand and waved. I didn't stick around to see what would happen next. I slammed the gas pedal and tore out of the lot, my tires kicking up gravel as I sped down the road. The trees blurred past me, the road stretching endlessly before me. And yet, when I checked my rearview mirror again, the RV park was still there. No matter how far I drove, it never disappeared from sight, like it was waiting for me to come back, like I had never left. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the manager's knowing smile, heard his voice repeating things he had no way of knowing. My past, my private thoughts, my secrets. I hadn't told a soul, yet he spoke them like he'd lived inside my head. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were suffocating. I was in the RV, but it wasn't mine anymore. The walls pulsed like something alive, the air thick with static. The manager stood outside, staring through the windshield, his mouth moving, but no words came out, just that same droning hum. I tried to move, to scream, but my body wouldn't respond. Then, as if a switch flipped, I woke up gasping. It was still dark outside. The digital clock on my dashboard blinked 3 a.m. Something felt wrong. I reached for my phone, dead. That was impossible. I had plugged it in before going to sleep. My stomach twisted as I grabbed my car keys, hitting the unlock button to test the battery. No beep. No lights. Every single electronic device I had was dead. A cold sweat spread across my back. I stepped to the window and looked out at the park. That's when I noticed something even stranger. No other RVs had lights on. No soft glow from windows, no flickering TVs, nothing. Every single vehicle was dark, eerily still. The only thing that seemed to have power was the check-in office. The dim yellow porch light flickered, buzzing weakly, as if barely holding on to existence. And then I saw him, the manager. He was standing just outside the office door, motionless, his hands folded in front of him like he was waiting. The way his head tilted slightly to the side sent ice through my veins. Was he watching me? I swallowed hard, stepping back into the shadows of my RV. My breath came slow and shallow. My instincts screamed at me to stay put, to wait for morning, to pretend I hadn't seen anything. But then, without thinking, I whispered, "What do you want?" The second the words left my mouth, he moved. Not a normal step. Not a casual turn. It was like he glitched forward. One moment he was standing by the office. The next, he was at the edge of my campsite. I jerked back, my pulse hammering. His mouth didn't move, but his voice filled my head like a whisper carried through radio static. "You already know the answer." I stumbled backward, my heart slamming into my ribs. I had to be imagining this. Maybe I was still dreaming. Maybe stress and exhaustion had finally pushed me over the edge. But then, my phone screen flickered to life on the table. One new message. I didn't touch it. I didn't even move closer. I just stared as the screen glowed. The message was from an unknown number. "Don't run. Don't hide. IT won't change anything." I slammed my hands over my mouth, suppressing a scream. That's when I realized the air outside had gone dead silent. No wind. No insects. No distant hum of passing cars. It was as if the entire world had paused. I turned my eyes back toward the window. The manager was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, body frozen, lungs barely working. But when I finally forced myself to move, I locked every door and shut every curtain. I curled into the driver's seat, hands clutching my knees, listening to the stillness. Somewhere outside, I swore I heard the crackle of a radio, just barely audible beneath the silence. The next morning, I didn't sleep. I stayed in that seat until the first gray light of dawn crept through the blinds. My body ached from the tension, my skin clammy with sweat. With shaking hands, I reached for my phone. The message was gone. No sign of it in my inbox. No notifications. No call log. It was as if it had never existed. I exhaled sharply, forcing myself to move, to do something besides sit there like a terrified child. I needed to get out of that park. Steeling my nerves, I cracked the RV door open and stepped outside. The air smelled wrong. There was no other way to describe it. It was sterile, empty, like the scent of a hospital hallway. The birds were back, chirping, but their calls sounded off, almost like a recording played on a loop. The other campers were moving around, going about their morning routines. But something about them unsettled me. They all moved the same way, too stiff, too synchronized. I rubbed my arms, trying to shake the unease. I wasn't imagining this. Something was wrong with this place. Then I noticed something even worse. The check-in office. It looked new. Not just clean, not just well maintained, but brand new, like it had been rebuilt overnight. The chipped paint, the old wooden sign, the worn down steps, it was all gone. Instead, the building looked untouched, fresh, as if it had been reset. As if yesterday had never happened. My mouth went dry as I turned to the other campers, trying to gauge their reactions, to see if they noticed anything strange. But none of them even glanced at it, like they'd always known it to look this way. A creeping realization settled over me. They weren't new visitors. They were always here. And I wasn't supposed to notice that. The breaking point. I needed answers. My fear battled against my better judgment, but I couldn't leave without understanding what was happening. So, I did the one thing I shouldn't have done. I went back to the check-in office. My footsteps felt too loud as I approached, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I half expected the manager to be standing there, waiting for me. But the door was open, not locked, not sealed shut like before. The moment I stepped inside, a wall of static noise flooded my ears. The radio sat on the counter, crackling with an almost melodic hum. The walls, the floor, the air itself felt thicker, heavier. Then, beneath the static, I heard something. A voice. Not clear, not human, but something speaking in rhythmic pulses. You were never meant to stay. I spun around, heart lurching into my throat. The manager was standing inside the room with me. The door had shut behind him without a sound. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes looked through me, as if I wasn't entirely there. They let you in because you don't belong anywhere else. My breath hitched, but now you know too much. The static roared to life, deafening, drowning out every thought in my head. My vision blurred as the world around me seemed to shift. The walls peeled, revealing something underneath. Something pulsing, alive. The floor beneath me felt endless, like I was standing on the edge of something vast and hollow. And the manager, he wasn't human anymore. Not a ghost, not a man, something in between. And as my consciousness flickered, as the static swallowed me whole, I finally understood. There was no RV park. There never had been. This place existed for one purpose. To keep people like me trapped. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in that office, swallowed by static. The manager loomed before me, his face blank yet knowing, his eyes drilling into me like he was studying something that shouldn't exist. You were never meant to come here. The voice didn't come from his mouth. It came from everywhere. From the walls, from the crackling radio, from inside my own head. The weight of the air changed, pressing against my skin, making my bones ache. The office around me warped, pulsing like something alive. The wooden counter, the shelves, the walls, they were all shifting. I reached back blindly for the door handle, but my fingers found nothing. The door wasn't there anymore. Just a solid wall. My stomach twisted violently. Let me out. My voice barely came out as a whisper. You don't belong anywhere else. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The radio on the counter screeched with a burst of static, and then, my own voice came through. Let me out. It was my voice, but distorted. Stretched, like a recording playing back at the wrong speed. You already know how this ends. The manager took a step toward me. His body moved too smoothly, like he was gliding instead of walking. I bolted, or at least I tried to. The moment I turned, the room shifted again. The floor stretched, lengthened, twisted beneath my feet. I wasn't running toward an exit anymore. I was running deeper into something. The radio screeched. The walls breathed. And the manager's voice whispered in my skull. We let you in because you're already lost. I gasped for breath, my vision darkening at the edges. My own heartbeat was too loud, too erratic. But then, the static changed. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was words. I heard names. Names I didn't recognize, but somehow, I knew they belonged to the other campers. The man with the dented airstream. The old couple by the fire pit. The young woman who always wore the same hoodie. The static hummed, weaving their stories through the air, and I understood. They had all been here before. Not just staying here. They had been trapped here. Their voices tangled together, distorted like old radio transmissions. I don't remember where I was before. This place will reset. I think I used to have a different name. A wave of nausea hit me. I wasn't just some unlucky traveler who had stumbled into a creepy RV park. I was next. The escape attempt. A new kind of fear crashed over me. The kind that numbs your limbs, that paralyzes thought. But I forced myself to focus. I need to get out. I need to leave. I turned sharply, trying to find anything that resembled an exit. But the office was a maze now. The door was gone, the walls were stretching, the ceiling too high, like the building was growing around me. I clenched my jaw. If there was no exit, I'd make one. I reached for the nearest heavy object, an old metal cash register, and swung it toward the window with everything I had. Bang! The glass didn't just break, it shattered silently, like the sound itself had been sucked out of existence. The pieces didn't fall. They hovered in the air, suspended in the static-filled haze. But beyond the broken window, I didn't see the RV park. I saw nothing, just an endless, shifting void. A deep horror settled into my chest. This place isn't real. The RV park isn't real. The moment I understood that, the walls lurched. The air rippled. And the manager, he smiled. "You figured it out." I turned, heart slamming against my ribs. The radio crackled. A single phrase hissed through the static, in my own voice. "You don't get to leave." The ground dropped out from under me. The impossible road. I landed hard, but not on the office floor. My hands scraped against asphalt. I gasped, rolling onto my back. I was on a road. The night sky stretched above me, starless, empty. My RV sat just a few feet away, parked along the shoulder like nothing had happened. For a moment, my body refused to move. I lay there, gasping, dizzy. But then, a footstep. My pulse stopped. I turned my head slowly. The manager stood at the edge of the road, watching, waiting, and then he lifted a single finger and pointed. Not at me, at the RV. "Drive." I scrambled to my feet, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grab my keys. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and jammed the key into the ignition. The RV roared to life. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead. I didn't hesitate. I floored the gas. The RV lurched forward, tires screeching. My breath came in ragged bursts, my mind racing. I didn't dare look back. The road stretched ahead of me, too straight, too empty. No signs, no turns, just a single, endless highway. But then, the radio clicked on. At first, just static. Then a voice. My voice. "You've been here before." A choked sob caught in my throat. "You never really left." I pressed harder on the gas, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. The road stretched on, endless, unchanging. And then, I saw it. A sign. It flickered in the distance, barely visible through the haze. My heart slammed against my ribs. If I could reach that sign, maybe, I could break free. The radio crackled again. "That's what you thought last time, too." I sucked in a breath, my foot not easing up. The headlights illuminated the sign as I raced past it. My stomach dropped. The words on the sign read, "Welcome to the manager's RV park. Vacancy always." The breath ripped from my lungs. I slammed the brakes. The RV skidded to a stop. I turned, wild-eyed, looking out the window, and my stomach turned to ice. I was back in the RV park. The neon vacancy sign flickered in the night. The office light glowed dimly, just like before. And at the entrance, he stood there, waiting, smiling, like he knew all along. The realization. I didn't move. I couldn't. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, breathing too fast, too hard. I had driven full speed away from here, but I had never left. The manager took a step forward, hands clasped neatly in front of him. And then he tilted his head, not like a person, like a thing trying to mimic human curiosity. The radio whispered one last message. "You can try again." Then, click, the RV turned off. The lights inside flickered and died, and outside the window, the manager was still waiting. For me, I didn't move. I couldn't. The RV's interior had gone dark, the dashboard cold beneath my trembling hands. My breath hitched in my throat, my chest rising and falling in quick, uneven gasps. Outside, the manager stood perfectly still, watching. His expression remained eerily calm, as if he had all the time in the world. And maybe he did. I reached for the ignition, fingers shaking. I twisted the key. Nothing. The engine didn't even try to turn over. A sharp pulse of panic shot through me. No. I turned the key again. And again. Dead. The radio flickered back on with a soft, distorted hum. Static filled the silence. And then, I heard myself. It won't start. My body locked up. The radio had just spoken my exact words, but I hadn't said them yet. A sickening dread curled in my stomach. Try again. I jerked away from the radio, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The manager took a single step closer. The movement was almost imperceptible, but I felt it like a shift in gravity pressing down on me. I squeezed my eyes shut. Think. I had to break this cycle. If I stayed, I would end up just like the others. The old couple, the man in the dented Airstream, the woman in the hoodie. They weren't campers. They were prisoners. I reached for my phone, fumbling with shaking hands. The screen lit up, but there was only one app, the reservation system. A single booking glowed at the top of the screen. Check in, 7 days ago. Check out, pending. A strangled noise caught in my throat. I tapped at the screen furiously, trying to close it, trying to exit, trying to do anything, but it didn't respond. The screen only refreshed. And when it did, the date had changed. Check in 1 day ago. The past had reset. The loop had restarted. A wave of nausea crashed over me. No, that couldn't be right. I've been here longer than a day. I know I have. I looked back at the office. The manager was gone. The breath caught in my throat. I whipped my head around, scanning the darkness. And then, a tap on the driver's side window. My whole body locked up. Slowly, I turned my head. The manager stood inches from the glass. His face was too pale, too smooth, like it had been repainted too many times. His lips never moved, but I heard his voice anyway. Ready to check in? I screamed. The realization. The world around me glitched. The RV shuddered like reality itself had been punched. The neon vacancy sign outside the office flickered wildly, the letters shifting, changing. For a brief, horrifying second, the words rearranged themselves into something else. No way out. My breath came in fast, sharp bursts. My mind was slipping. I reached for the door handle, but my fingers wouldn't close around it. It wasn't there. I looked down. My hands weren't there either. A horrible coldness wrapped around my skull. I turned back to the window and saw my own reflection. But it wasn't me. The person in the glass was smiling. A slow, knowing smile. The manager's voice whispered in my head, low and final. You were always meant to stay. I felt something snap, like my identity itself had cracked in half. My memories blurred, fading like old film reels. The road I'd driven on, the places I'd visited before this. Gone. All that remained was the RV park, the sign, the radio, and him. The last thing I saw before everything turned to static was my own face. Smiling back at me, underscore 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 underscore. Epilogue: the new manager. A car pulled into the lot. Its headlights sliced through the thick night air, illuminating the cracked pavement of the RV park. Inside the car, a new traveler sat gripping the wheel, their face drawn with exhaustion. They looked up at the neon sign, blinking against the darkness. Vacancy. The light outside the office flickered on, and from the shadows, a figure stepped forward, calm, patient, with a face that had once belonged to someone else. Welcome, the manager said. We've been expecting you. Next story. The arrival, a quiet, empty RV park. I wasn't expecting to stop that night. I had planned to push through a few more hours of driving, maybe find a well-lit truck stop or a proper RV park with at least a few other travelers around. But my eyes were heavy, and the fatigue had started settling deep into my bones. Then, like some kind of unspoken invitation, I saw the old wooden sign on the side of the road. Crescent Pines RV Park, vacancy. There was no exit ramp, no clear turn-off, just a narrow dirt road that cut into the dense treeline. It wasn't on my map. Hell, I hadn't seen a single listing for it on any travel app either. But in my exhaustion, I convinced myself it must be one of those hidden, lesser-known campgrounds. The kind that old-time RVers knew about but never bothered to list online. Besides, the alternative was falling asleep behind the wheel, and I wasn't about to risk that. So I took the turn. My tires crunched over loose gravel as I followed the winding dirt road deeper into the trees. The moment I entered, my signal dropped. No bars. Just no service. That should have been my first red flag. The place looked abandoned. A small wooden office sat near the entrance, dark and lifeless. No lights, no cars. Just a single drop box nailed to the front with a faded sign that read, "Pick a spot. Pay in cash." I grabbed an envelope from the box, scrawled my RV's info on it, and slipped a few bills inside. It felt weird just leaving money like that, but I figured if anyone came around, they'd check eventually. I picked a spot near the back, close to the tree line. It wasn't much, just a gravel pad with an old wooden picnic table beside it. The whole area felt oddly still. No wind, no bugs chirping, just silence. I told myself I was being paranoid. It's just an old, empty park. That's all. The first sign of unease. By the time I set up, the last of the sunlight had disappeared, swallowed by the thick canopy above. I flicked on my RV's exterior lights, illuminating the small clearing around me. The beams cast long, spindly shadows against the trees, stretching unnaturally in the dim glow. I had just sat down inside, scrolling through my phone out of habit, when I remembered, no signal, not even Wi-Fi. I set my phone aside and leaned back, listening to the quiet. Then I saw it. Just outside my window, standing at the edge of the tree-line, was a shadow. At first, I thought it was a tree or maybe a trick of the light. But the longer I stared, the more I realized it was too tall, too thin, too human. It didn't move. It didn't shift. It just stood there. And then I noticed something else. Something that made my stomach twist into a tight, anxious knot. Even in the dark, even with barely any light to make out details, I could see the faintest curve of a grin. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, looked again. Nothing. The trees stood empty. My porch light flickered slightly, casting jittery shadows across the dirt. I let out a slow breath. Just exhaustion. My brain playing tricks on me after a long day of driving. But even as I climbed into bed, a single thought crept into the back of my mind, refusing to let go. It was watching me. The dead air. I woke up in the middle of the night with a start. No sound. No reason. Just that eerie, suffocating silence. I shifted under my blanket, ears straining for anything. A distant owl, the rustling of leaves, even the hum of my RV's generator. Nothing. The only noise was the faint static of my old travel radio on the counter. I didn't remember turning it on. I sat up slowly, my heart thudding a little harder. The radio crackled, the sound thick and distorted, like it was trying to pull a signal from some far-off, unreachable station. A whisper cut through the static, a low, wet chuckle. My breath caught. The sound was brief, so faint I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But it was there. I heard it. I grabbed the radio and clicked it off. Silence returned. And then a knock. A single, deliberate tap against the RV door. I froze. Another knock. I swallowed hard, forcing my brain into logic mode. An animal. The wind. A tree branch. But deep down, I already knew. I didn't want to, but I had to look. I had to see. Slowly, cautiously, I shifted toward the window, lifting just a sliver of the curtain. And that's when I saw it again. The shadow, standing closer this time, just outside the reach of the porch light. That same too-thin frame, that same unnatural grin. It didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't blink, just smiled. I dropped the curtain instantly, my pulse hammering in my ears. For the first time in years of RV travel, I felt real fear. And I wasn't sure if I would make it through the night. A restless night. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of that smiling shadow burned itself into my mind. That grin, too wide, too knowing, felt like it was still out there watching. I kept telling myself it wasn't real, that I had just imagined it. But the fear didn't fade. Around 3 a.m., I finally drifted off into a restless half-sleep. But then thud. I bolted upright. Another thud. It came from outside. Closed. Maybe just a few feet from my RV door. My mouth went dry. I strained my ears, listening for anything. Footsteps, breathing, rustling, but the world outside was silent. Then, just as I thought I had imagined the noise, I heard a low, slow dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the gravel. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. The sound stopped. A beat of silence. And then, a single, deliberate knock on my RV door. I squeezed my eyes shut, my fingers digging into the blanket. I wasn't going to look. I wasn't. But then, through the thin walls of my RV, I heard something I shouldn't have been able to hear. A voice. I know you're in there. The unshaken stillness of morning. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because I woke up to sunlight streaming through the blinds. For a moment, I was disoriented. Had I dreamed it? Had I really heard that voice? But then I saw the footprints, right outside my RV. A clear set of bare footprints in the dirt. They led from the tree line to my RV door, and then nothing. No return prints, as if whoever made them had just vanished. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. I scanned the campground, looking for any sign of movement, but the place was as dead as the night before. Still, I wasn't about to let paranoia get the best of me. I stepped outside, squinting against the morning light. The picnic table near my RV was covered in a thin layer of dew, except for one spot, right at the end of the bench. A perfect, dry imprint, like someone had been sitting there watching me. The first attempt to leave. That was it. That was my sign to leave. I climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life. Relief flooded through me as I shifted into reverse. But then it died. My heart lurched. I tried again. Click. Nothing. I checked my battery, my fuel. Everything was normal. But for some reason, the RV just wouldn't start. A creeping sense of dread settled in my stomach. I needed help. The campground office was still dark, still empty. But maybe, just maybe, there was someone around. So I did the one thing I really didn't want to do. I started walking toward the trees, the whispering woods. The second I stepped past the first row of trees, the air changed. It was subtle at first, like stepping into an empty house where no one has lived for years. The kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl. Then came the whispers. Faint, garbled, just beyond my hearing. I turned sharply, scanning the trees. Nothing. I kept walking. The farther I went, the colder it got. Then snap. A branch broke behind me. I spun around. No one. But as I stood there listening, I felt it. That horrible, sinking feeling of being watched. And then I saw them. Footprints. Not just one set. Multiple. Surrounding me. Closing in. I ran. A distorted reflection. I burst out of the trees, gasping for breath. Something was wrong. The campground looked different. Like I had stepped into a version of it that had been abandoned for years. The wood of the picnic table was rotted and splintered. My RV looked wrong. The windows were too dark, too empty. And then I saw myself, standing at the RV window. A reflection? No, it was someone else. Someone with my face. But their grin was too wide. And they were watching me. Something is wrong with the reflection. I stood frozen outside my RV, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The figure in the window wasn't me. It had my face, same features, same hair, even the same exhausted look in its eyes. But something was off. Its grin was too wide, too deliberate, like it knew something I didn't. I took a step forward, my hands trembling. The reflection didn't move. It just watched. Then suddenly it waved. Not a normal wave. A slow, deliberate lift of the hand, fingers curling in a way that sent a cold spike of dread through my gut. I staggered back. My real reflection should have moved with me. But it didn't. Instead, it tilted its head. And then, it stepped away from the window, into my RV, the locked door and the thing inside. My first instinct was to get inside, to check if something was really there. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe my exhaustion was getting to me. But when I reached the RV door, my hand hesitated over the handle. The door was locked. I never locked it. I twisted the handle, yanking hard. It wouldn't budge. Then from inside, a noise. A slow, dragging shuffle, coming from the back of the RV. My heart pounded. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to listen. Silence. Then 3 soft knocks. From inside. I stumbled back. That was impossible. I had been outside the whole time. No one had gone in. No one should be in there. But I had heard the footsteps. I had seen the thing in the window, and it had waved at me. The shadow in the woods. Panic surged through me. I needed help, someone else to witness this. I turned toward the RV park's main road, scanning the empty campsites. No movement. No lights. No signs of life. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shape in the trees. Tall. Motionless. Watching me. I turned my head slowly, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing just at the tree line, was the smiling shadow. A dark silhouette against the moonlight, featureless except for its grin. It didn't move, didn't breathe. It just stood there, grinning. The same awful, knowing grin I had seen in my reflection. I stumbled backward, my pulse hammering. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then it took a step forward. The voices in the static. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away. I sprinted toward the darkened RV park office, my breath ragged. My feet pounded against the dirt, my vision swimming with fear. The door was locked, but I pounded on it anyway. Help! My voice was raw, desperate. Someone please. No answer. Then, the radio inside crackled to life. A burst of static, sharp and grating. I pressed my ear against the glass, heart hammering. Beneath the static, voices. Faint. Whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but they were there, multiple voices, layered over one another. And then one of them cut through the noise. A whisper, right next to my ear. Let it in. The imitator. I stumbled back, shaking my head violently. No, this wasn't real. I turned back toward my RV and froze. The door was open, wide open, and standing in the doorway was me. Or something that looked like me. Same clothes, same posture, but the face wrong. Its lips were stretched into that horrible, unnatural grin. And its eyes, completely black. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. It lifted one hand and beckoned me forward. I took a step back. It took a step out of the RV, toward me. My stomach twisted in horror. I turned and ran. But before I disappeared into the night, I heard its voice. My own voice, calling after me. You can't leave. I'm already here. The chase begins. I ran, blindly, heart pounding, breath burning, legs shaking. I ran because I had no other choice. Behind me, the thing that wore my face followed. I could hear its footsteps. Slow, deliberate, not running. It didn't have to. It knew I had nowhere to go. I sprinted past darkened RVs, past picnic tables and empty fire pits. The entire park felt deserted, like I was the only real person left. Then a shadow moved ahead, blocking my path. Another figure, identical to me, grinning, waiting. I skidded to a stop, my breath catching in my throat. A cold, terrible realization crept in. There wasn't just one of them. There were many, and they were closing in. A wrong turn into darkness. I turned sharply and bolted toward the forest. Branches clawed at my skin as I stumbled into the trees. The world beyond the park faded, swallowed by unnatural darkness. And then the silence. No more footsteps. No more whispers. I slowed, my chest heaving. Had I lost them? I turned, scanning the twisted trees. My head throbbed, my vision blurred. The RV park had disappeared. I had no idea where I was. And then a voice. Soft. Close. Why are you running? I whipped around. A shadow stood inches from my face. Grinning. I stumbled back, only to hit another. And another. The trees weren't trees anymore. They were them. Hundreds of them. All wearing my face. All grinning. And they began to laugh. The mirror game. The laughter swelled. Echoing. Warping. I covered my ears, but it didn't stop. It was inside my head. And then, all at once, they stopped moving. Everything froze. Like a video on pause. And slowly, one of them stepped forward. The first one. The original copy. It cocked its head, watching me. Studying me. Then, in my own voice, it whispered, "Let's play a game." My mouth went dry. What game? I stammered. Its grin widened. "If you guess which one of us is real, you can leave." My blood ran cold. I turned, looking at the countless identical figures. They all grinned. They all mimicked me. But only one of us was real. Me. Right? I wasn't so sure anymore. The wrong choice. My chest tightened. I had to think. I had to figure this out. I looked at my hands. They were shaking. The shadows? Still. Too still. That had to mean something. I turned to the one who had spoken, the leader. "It's you," I whispered. "You're the real one." Its grin stretched impossibly wide. And it whispered back. Wrong. The world collapsed. The shadows rushed forward, their grins warping, their voices melding into one deafening howl. I screamed, but there was no sound. Everything blurred, warped. Then suddenly, I was back in my RV. The final revelation. I gasped, my hands clutching the steering wheel. Morning light streamed through the windshield. My heart still pounded. My skin was cold with sweat. Had it been a dream? I turned, scanning the RV. Everything looked normal. No shadows. No grinning figures. Just me. I exhaled shakily and reached for the keys. I needed to leave. But then, I caught my reflection. In the rearview mirror. My blood went cold. Because the version of me in the mirror was grinning. A new reality. I didn't move. I couldn't. The reflection in the rearview mirror was still me, but not. It grinned too wide, stretching beyond what human lips should allow. I forced myself to breathe. In. Out. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. I reached up slowly, my fingers trembling, and touched my own face. Smooth. Normal. No grin. But in the mirror, my reflection didn't follow. It just watched me, smiling, waiting. A sharp jolt of terror ripped through me. I had to get out of here. I slammed the keys into the ignition. The RV roared to life. The reflection grinned wider. And then it moved. Not me, just it. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its eyes dark pools of something I couldn't comprehend. And then, in my own voice, it whispered, "You're already gone." The escape that wasn't. No. I shook my head, gripping the wheel too tight. This wasn't happening. It wasn't real. I hit the gas, tearing out of the RV park. Gravel sprayed as I sped down the narrow road. The trees blurred past me, the morning sun glaring off the windshield. Just drive. Drive and don't look back. The park disappeared in the rearview mirror. But, so did everything else. I glanced at the GPS. No signal. The road stretched endlessly ahead, but the miles didn't change. I swallowed hard, forcing my eyes forward. It was just a glitch. That's all. And then, the sign appeared. "Welcome to Crescent Pines RV Park." I slammed the brakes. My stomach twisted. No, I had just left. I looked around wildly. I was back, right at the entrance, as if I had never left at all. The endless loop. The radio crackled. A soft, whispering static. I shuddered, my hands gripping the wheel as I struggled to breathe. The RV wasn't moving anymore, but the world outside? It was wrong. The sun hadn't shifted. The trees didn't sway. Even the clouds were identical to how they were before, like time had stopped. Then, from the speakers, a voice. My voice. "You can't leave." I lunged for the radio, twisting the dial, trying to change the station. Nothing but static, and beneath it, soft laughter. I clenched my jaw. No, I wasn't playing this game. I turned off the RV and shoved the door open. I'd find help. I'd walk if I had to. But as soon as my feet hit the ground, a shadow moved, right in front of me. Tall, unmoving, smiling. The final question. I froze. The shadow wasn't just a shape. It was me. Not just in the way a reflection looks like you. It was me. Same height, same stance, same clothes. But its face was wrong. It grinned wider than a human should. Eyes too deep, like it knew something I didn't. It tilted its head, watching, waiting. Then it raised a hand, a slow, deliberate movement. And it waved, like we were old friends, like it was happy to see me. And then it spoke. "Are you sure you're you?" The realization. My breath caught. The question echoed in my skull, sinking deep into something I didn't want to confront. I took a shaky step back. And then I turned, raced back into the RV, slammed the door, locked it. My mind spun, my pulse hammering. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I just needed to sleep. Yes, that was it. I was tired, delirious. I crawled into bed, pulling the blanket over me like a child hiding from a nightmare. I just needed to rest. Everything would be fine when I woke up. It had to be. The last look. I awoke to silence. My body felt heavy, like I had been asleep for a long time. I sat up slowly, my head pounding. For a moment, everything felt normal, like the nightmare was over, until I glanced toward the front of the RV and saw someone sitting in the driver's seat. Me. I went cold. The figure had its back to me, still, silent, like a doll waiting to be wound up. Then its head turned. Not the body, just the head, and it smiled. "You finally woke up." The truth I can't escape. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The figure in the seat turned fully now, resting its arms on the wheel, like it had been waiting all along. Watching, waiting for me to wake up. "Took you long enough," it said in my voice. I shook my head. "You're not real." It laughed. Not a deep, guttural horror movie laugh. A soft, understanding chuckle, like it knew something I didn't. Like it felt sorry for me. Then, in a voice filled with something almost like pity, it said, "Oh, I think you already know the truth." My heart stopped, because in that moment, I did. The memories rushed back. The loops, the smiling shadow, the reflection that didn't move. I hadn't been running from something. I had been fighting to remember. And now I finally did. I wasn't the original. I was the copy. The smiling end. A slow realization settled over me. The kind that comes too late. I wasn't the one looking at the smiling shadow. I was the shadow. The me in the driver's seat. That was the real me. And he had finally woken up. The figure smiled warmly, almost grateful. "It's okay," he said gently. "You can rest now." And then, the world faded. Next story. I didn't stop at the RV park because I wanted to. It was late, and exhaustion had crept into my bones like a slow-moving fog. My original plan was to push through the last few hours of my drive, but when my vision started blurring at the edges and my hands felt sluggish on the wheel, I knew I had to pull over. The park itself was small, nestled on the edge of a dense forest. The wooden sign at the entrance was faded, its letters peeling. Creekside RV Park, except Creekside, had been partially burned away, leaving only Side RV Park. I barely registered it. At that point, I was running on fumes. A single floodlight buzzed weakly above the park's tiny office, casting sickly yellow light over the gravel lot. The building was locked up for the night, but a laminated sign taped to the window read, "Late arrivals, take any open spot and pay in the morning." Fine by me. I maneuvered my RV into an empty space toward the back, near the tree line. The nearest camper was several spaces down, an old, battered Airstream with no signs of life inside. The rest of the park looked abandoned. The silence was heavy. No voices, no movement, just the faint rustling of trees in the wind and the occasional chirp of a distant cricket. I turned off the engine, and for a moment, everything was still. Then I heard it, a soft, rapid scuttling sound above me. I froze. My hands were still on the steering wheel, my breath caught in my throat. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It came from the roof, just over the driver's seat. The sound was so light, so quick, that at first, I convinced myself I had imagined it. It had to be an animal. A raccoon, maybe. I listened, heart hammering, waiting for it to continue. Silence. A slow exhale slipped from my lips. Just my imagination. I shook off the tension and climbed into the back of the RV, locking the door behind me. The space was small but comfortable, just a kitchenette, a booth-style table, and a bed tucked into the rear. It felt safe. By the time I climbed into bed, the sound was already fading from memory. The second night. The next morning, I barely thought about the sound from the night before. After paying the small fee at the office and grabbing a cup of stale coffee from their self-serve station, I debated whether to leave or stay another night. The road stretched endlessly ahead of me, and the idea of another long drive wasn't appealing. Besides, the park, despite its eerie emptiness, was peaceful. The air smelled fresh, and the trees offered a nice shade from the summer heat. I decided to stay. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I settled in for another quiet night. And then I heard it again, scuttling, a rapid, jittery movement across the roof. I bolted upright in bed, heart pounding. This time, I was sure I wasn't imagining it. The sound was too deliberate, too fast, as if something with multiple legs was skittering across the surface. I held my breath, straining to hear over the hammering in my chest. Scratch, scratch, scratch. My stomach twisted. It was moving, sliding from one side of the roof to the other, the soft patter of movement echoing through the RV's thin walls. And then just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I waited. 5 seconds. 10. Nothing. I swallowed hard. Animals don't just stop like that. Fumbling for my phone, I switched on the flashlight and crept toward the RV door. The small window above the kitchenette offered a glimpse outside. The dark tree line, the empty lot, the distant glow of the office's flickering light. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Taking a deep breath, I unlatched the door and stepped outside. The night air was thick and humid. I aimed my flashlight at the roof, my fingers clenching around the cold metal handle. Nothing, just the smooth aluminum surface, reflecting the beam of my light. No animals, no debris, nothing at all. I let out a nervous laugh. I was losing it. Shaking my head, I climbed back inside and locked the door behind me. It had to be my imagination. Maybe a squirrel or a bird. Maybe. I crawled back into bed and shut my eyes. Sleep came slowly, unease curling in my stomach. But eventually exhaustion won. The third night, the thing leaves a mark. By the third night, I was already questioning my sanity. But I stayed anyway. I told myself it was nothing, that I was being paranoid. The night was dead quiet. Too quiet. I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, waiting, listening. And then, scratch, scratch, scratch. I shot up, heart slamming against my ribs. It was back, and this time it was louder. Click, click, click. The sound had changed. It wasn't just scuttling anymore. It was tapping, like tiny, deliberate fingers drumming against the metal roof. I barely breathed. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to move, to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen, gripping the sheets like a lifeline. The tapping grew faster, closer. Then, a long, dragging scrape cut through the silence, as if something was being slowly pulled across the roof. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and bolted outside, heart hammering. The second I stepped into the cool night air, I aimed the light at the roof, and my breath caught in my throat. Long, deep scratches marred the metal surface. Not just scratches, grooves. Deep, claw-like indentations where something had dragged itself across the top of my RV. My stomach twisted. No animal could have made those. I scanned the area, my flashlight beam shaking in my grip. The airstream down the lot sat in eerie silence. The trees beyond it stood still, untouched by the wind. Something was wrong. I turned back toward the RV, breath coming in ragged gasps. And then, I heard it, a faint, deliberate clicking, coming from directly above me. My blood ran cold. Something was still up there, a night of unease. The second night at the campsite, the feeling of unease started creeping in. The day had been normal, even peaceful. I spent most of the afternoon hiking through the trails behind the campground, enjoying the solitude and the crisp, pine-scented air. I had chosen this spot to get away from the constant noise of everyday life, to disconnect. Out here, my only company was the occasional distant hum of an insect, the chirp of birds, and the rustling of branches swaying in the wind. As the sun began to sink behind the trees, I returned to my RV, eager to unwind. Dinner was simple, a can of chili, some bread, and a cold beer. I left my radio on low, its soft, crackling music filling the space while I flipped through an old paperback. The world outside darkened quickly, the campground settling into a thick silence. And then I heard it, a soft scratching sound above me. It was faint at first, so quiet I barely noticed. A small, quick movement against the roof, almost like a tree branch dragging across metal. But when I stepped outside to check, the sky was clear, and the nearest trees were too far to be the culprit. Maybe a raccoon, I thought. I climbed back inside, locked the door, and told myself I was being paranoid. But an hour later, the sound returned. This time it was louder. It wasn't just scratching. It was movement. Something was crawling across the roof of my RV. The weight of it was unsettling, too heavy for a raccoon, too deliberate for a bird. It scuttled from one side of the roof to the other, the sound sharp against the metal surface. Click, 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 like too many legs tapping in quick succession. I held my breath, listening. A minute passed. Then two. Silence. I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. Maybe it was the wind playing tricks on me. Maybe exhaustion was making me hear things. Still, I double-checked the door locks before finally climbing into bed. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was safe. But the feeling of being watched settled into my bones, and sleep did not come easy that night. Doubting reality. The next morning, I was ready to forget about the noises. I stepped outside, stretching in the cool morning air. Everything looked normal. The trees stood still, the dirt road winding through the campsite undisturbed. There was no sign that anything had crawled onto my RV the night before. No scratches, no footprints, nothing. Maybe I really had imagined it. I walked around the RV just to be sure, checking the roof as best as I could from the ground. Everything looked perfectly fine. Still, a nagging feeling wouldn't leave me. By the time the sun began to dip below the trees again, I found myself dreading the night. I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous, that there was a logical explanation. I kept the radio on louder that evening, letting the music fill the space as I busied myself with small tasks, cleaning up, organizing my things, trying to shake off the lingering tension from the previous night. Then, just as I was about to turn in, I heard it again. The same clicking. Soft, careful, moving across the roof. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the table. My mind screamed at me to stay still, to listen. The crawling noise moved from one end of the RV to the other. Then silence. My breath came in short, shallow bursts. I reached for my flashlight, my hand shaking slightly. Then, thud, a sharp, sudden impact from above. I stumbled back, my pulse hammering in my ears. Something had jumped onto the roof. The fear sets in. I barely slept that night. I stayed awake, sitting in the dark, listening. Every few minutes, I would hear a faint click, a slow, deliberate movement of whatever was up there. Sometimes it would stop for long periods, as if it was waiting, watching. Sometime around 3 a.m., I worked up the courage to peek outside. I flipped the porch light on and cracked open the door just enough to see. The night was still, empty. The trees stood in their usual places. The dirt path remained undisturbed. Nothing unusual. I exhaled, shaking my head. Maybe I was really losing it. But just as I started to close the door, click, it came from above me. A crawling, scuttling sound. Right overhead. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart pounding. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Evidence of the unseen. Morning finally came, though it felt like an eternity. I forced myself to step outside, feeling both dread and urgency. Something had been up there last night. I knew it. I circled the RV, scanning for anything unusual. That's when I saw it. Near the edge of the roof, where the metal met the side panel, were deep, thin scratches. Too long to be from a bird. Too sharp to be from a raccoon. Something had clawed its way across the top of my RV. I felt sick. I couldn't explain it anymore. I grabbed a stick and reached up, tapping against the roof to test for any loose panels or debris. Nothing. Then I saw the footprints. On the ground, right outside my RV, were strange tracks. They were small, too small to be a bear or coyote, but the shape was unnatural. Thin, long, almost insect-like. I had no idea what could have made them. I crouched down, staring at them for far too long, trying to convince myself they were just a trick of the dirt. But they weren't. And worse, they led away from my RV. Not toward the forest, not toward the road, but straight up to the nearest tree. The tracks just stopped there, as if whatever made them had climbed up and vanished. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what it was. All I knew was that it was watching me, waiting, and it would come back again tonight. The third night, the weight of dread. By the third night, fear had fully settled into my bones. I had tried to brush it off the first time, convinced myself it was just a raccoon or a bird. The second night, I had started doubting that explanation. But by the third, I knew. I wasn't alone out here. I spent the entire day on edge, constantly glancing toward the roof of my RV, checking the trees for any sign of movement. The footprints, the ones that had led straight up to a tree and vanished, still haunted my mind. I thought about leaving. I should have left, but something kept me rooted to this spot. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was denial, or maybe deep down I needed to know. The first sign, the knocking. That evening, I locked the RV door early and kept my flashlight within reach. I had no appetite. The tension in my gut was too tight. As darkness fell over the campground, I sat in silence, waiting. For a while, nothing happened. Then, just past midnight, knock, knock, a gentle tapping against the roof. I stopped breathing. The knocking was too precise, too deliberate. Then, after a pause, knock, knock, knock. This wasn't an animal. Something was calling out to me. My pulse pounded in my ears. I gripped the flashlight tighter, staring up at the ceiling as if I could see through it. Then the knocking stopped. A few seconds of silence. Then, click, click, click. The sound of too many legs scuttling across the metal roof. It moved faster this time, back and forth, circling. It was searching for a way in. The impossible movement. I stayed frozen in place, barely daring to breathe. Then I heard a new sound. Something dragging. A slow, scraping noise, like nails being pulled along the edge of the RV. My skin prickled. I grabbed my phone, switched on the camera, and slowly reached up to open the small roof vent. I hesitated. I didn't want to see what was up there, but I had to. With one swift motion, I pushed the vent open a crack and aimed my phone upward, switching to the camera's front-facing mode. The screen was dark at first, just the night sky. Then something shifted. A shadow blocked out the stars. I barely registered what I was looking at before it moved. Too fast. One moment, the shadowy figure was above me. The next, it crawled down the side of the RV. The side of the RV, a shape that shouldn't be. I scrambled back, heart hammering. I knew it wasn't possible, but I heard it. The clicking of its legs as it moved sideways, gripping the smooth metal of the RV like gravity didn't apply to it. I turned off my phone screen, plunging the RV into darkness. I listened. The sound was everywhere. First the roof, then the side panel. Then, tap, tap. My breath caught in my throat. It was knocking on the window. I sat there, gripping my flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. For what felt like hours, I didn't move. Eventually, the noise faded. I don't know how long I waited before exhaustion took over. I passed out, heart still pounding. The fourth day, physical evidence. Morning came, and I stepped outside with shaky legs. I had to see it. I needed proof that I hadn't imagined last night. I walked around the RV slowly, scanning every inch. Then I saw them. Deep, jagged scratch marks along the metal. Too high to be from an animal. Too erratic to be from a tree branch. Worse, I looked down. The footprints were back. Thin, unnatural. And this time, they didn't just lead to a tree. They led up the side of my RV. My stomach dropped. This thing wasn't just watching me. It was getting bolder. I needed to leave. The attempt to escape. By midday, I had made my decision. I threw my gear into the RV, barely caring if I left things behind. I wasn't staying another night. I jumped into the driver's seat, turned the key, and nothing happened. The engine didn't even click. I tried again. Dead. I smacked the steering wheel in frustration. I had checked the battery before I left on this trip. The RV was in perfect condition. But now, it was as if something had drained it. I grabbed my phone to call for help. No service. My stomach turned to ice. The service had been spotty out here, but I had at least one bar yesterday. Now nothing. It felt intentional, like something wanted me stranded. The final night begins. As the sun dipped below the trees, I knew. I was trapped. I locked the doors, shut the curtains, sat in the dark, waiting, hoping that somehow this night would be different. It wasn't. By midnight, the clicking started again. This time it was worse. More frantic, more desperate. It pounded against the roof, dragged its claws along the walls. I covered my ears, rocking back and forth, praying for it to stop. And then, I heard breathing. Slow, raspy, coming from just outside the window. I knew it was there. I knew it was watching me. Then something whispered. A low, guttural voice, impossible to understand. But the meaning was clear. It knew I was inside, and it was hungry. The final mistake. In a panic, I grabbed my flashlight and made the worst decision of my life. I shined it at the window. For half a second, I saw it. A grotesque shape pressed against the glass. Not human, not animal. Too many legs, too many fingers. Its mouth too wide, grinning. And its eyes. It didn't have any eyes. Just empty, black pits that somehow saw me anyway. The moment my light hit it, the thing screeched. A horrific, otherworldly noise that rattled my bones. And then, it lunged. The lunge, nowhere left to hide. The moment the flashlight beam hit it, the thing lunged. I barely had time to react. Its grotesque form smashed against the side of the RV, rattling the entire vehicle. The force of it sent me stumbling backward, knocking over a stack of supplies. My flashlight slipped from my grip, rolling under the table, leaving me in near total darkness. But I didn't need to see it anymore. I could hear it. Its claws scraped against the metal, moving too fast, too erratic. It was trying to get in. I scrambled toward the flashlight, hands shaking, fingers fumbling blindly in the dark. Then, slam! A single, massive impact hit the roof. Dust shook from the ceiling. The cabinets rattled. Then silence. I held my breath. A long, sickening creak echoed through the RV. I looked up. My stomach dropped. The roof was bending inward. Something heavy was pressing down. Something huge. I grabbed a knife from my supplies and held it in front of me. But what good would it do against that? Then, tap, tap, the knocking again. But this time, it came from the vent above me. I looked up, and it was there, the face in the vent. Through the small slits of the overhead vent, something shifted. A shadow moved. Then, fingers curled around the edge. Too long, too thin. They dragged across the plastic with a slow, deliberate motion, like it was testing the barrier. Then the vent bulged inward. A deep, wet clicking sound filled the RV. I knew what was coming next. I acted on instinct, lunging forward and slamming my fist against the vent, trying to force it shut. For a brief moment, it stopped moving. Then, through the tiny slits, something grinned at me. A wide mouth, stretching too far across its face. Its teeth, jagged needle-like, were too sharp for any animal I had ever seen. But the worst part? It wasn't just grinning. It was laughing. The desperate escape plan. I knew I had seconds before it got in. I grabbed the knife, gripping it so tightly my hand ached. I slashed at the vent, trying to scare it back. It jerked away, but not far. I could hear it, moving fast, shifting across the roof again. It wasn't giving up. I had nowhere to run. I needed a plan. And then, I remembered. The emergency roof hatch. It was a terrible idea, but it was my only idea. I sucked in a deep breath, steadied my shaking hands, and moved fast. I climbed onto the table, reaching for the emergency exit above the bed. I hesitated for only a second. If I did this, I would be outside with it, but I didn't have a choice. I turned the handle. The hatch popped open. The rooftop confrontation. Cold air rushed in. The night outside was too quiet. No crickets. No wind. Like everything else in the world had stopped to watch. I poked my head out slowly, scanning the roof. Nothing. I braced myself, then pulled myself up onto the roof, the metal cold against my palms. For one terrible moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, it was gone. Then, click, click, click. It was behind me. I spun around, and finally I saw it clearly, the crawling thing in full view. My breath caught in my throat. It was huge, not quite human, not quite insect. Its body was wrong, twisted, hunched, its limbs too long, bending at impossible angles. Its fingers, each one too many joints, twitched against the roof. But its face, that grin, so wide, so unnatural. And the worst part, it had no eyes, just empty, gaping pits where I should have been. And yet, I knew it was looking at me. It saw me, it recognized me, and it laughed. A sick, wet, chittering sound that sent ice down my spine. Then, it lunged. The fight for survival. I rolled just in time. Its claws raked the roof, slicing deep gouges into the metal. I scrambled backward, nearly slipping off the edge. The thing twisted unnaturally, its limbs bending in ways that made my stomach churn. It moved fast, too fast. I gripped the knife, my pulse hammering. I had one chance. As it lunged again, I lashed out. The blade sank deep into its arm. It shrieked, a sound so inhuman, so ear-splitting, I thought my skull would split in half. But it didn't stop. It was angry now. I yanked the knife free and stabbed again, this time aiming for its chest. It jerked back, fast, skittering away, laughing again. That was when I realized. It wasn't afraid. It was playing with me. I wasn't fighting it off. I was just entertaining it. The fall. The RV shook violently as it scuttled toward me. I knew I wouldn't last much longer. Then, I made a split-second decision. I jumped. Not off the RV, but onto it. I grabbed at its twisted, bony arms, using my weight to drag it down with me. It shrieked, surprised, maybe even angry, as we both tumbled off the roof. We hit the ground hard. Pain shot through my ribs, but I didn't stop moving. I scrambled away, clutching my knife. The thing twitched, limbs contorting, mouth gaping wider. And for the first time, it let out a sound that wasn't laughter. It was rage. It scuttled backward, limbs folding inward, its grin twitching. Then, it vanished into the trees. Not running, not escaping, just waiting, watching. The aftermath, a moment of dread. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I sat there in the dirt, knife clutched in my trembling fingers, staring into the darkness. Waiting, listening, but it was gone. For now. I forced myself to stand, wincing from the pain. My RV sat there, dented, scratched, ruined. But it didn't matter. I was leaving. Now. I climbed inside, turned the key, and this time, the engine roared to life. The last thing I did before I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw something grinning back at me from the tree-line. Then it was gone. But I knew. It wasn't over. Not yet. The drive into darkness. I drove. I didn't think. I didn't look back. My hands clenched the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. My foot pressed the gas pedal harder than necessary, but I didn't care. The RV lurched forward, bumping and rattling as I sped down the dirt road, leaving the campsite, and that thing far behind. The headlights cut through the darkness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. It was irrational, I told myself. It was gone. But then why did the night feel too quiet? Why did I feel like I was driving in circles? The road that never ends. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Then an hour. The road stretched endlessly before me. The trees on either side looking the same no matter how far I went. I checked my phone. No service. I turned on the GPS. It wouldn't load. I was trapped in this loop of nothingness. A road that led nowhere, surrounded by a forest that had swallowed the rest of the world whole. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I was just shaken up, I told myself. Just paranoid. But deep down, I wasn't sure. Then, I saw something in the rearview mirror. The passenger that wasn't there. A shadow flickered in the back of the RV. I whipped my head around. Nothing. I turned back to the road, heart hammering. My breathing came fast and uneven, sweat sticking my shirt to my back. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. The trauma of the night messing with my head. That's what I told myself. But then, in the mirror, the curtain behind me moved. Not from the wind, not from the motion of the RV. It moved like something was behind it, something breathing. I clenched the steering wheel, trying to focus on the road. Don't look. Don't acknowledge it. I kept driving. But the longer I ignored it, the closer it got. The whisper in the static. I turned on the radio, desperate for any sound. White noise filled the RV. But buried within the static, a whisper. Faint. Familiar. Where are you going? My stomach dropped. The voice was mine. I reached for the dial with a shaking hand, twisting it, trying to change the station. But the whisper only got louder. You can't leave. I shut off the radio completely. Silence. But I wasn't alone. I felt it. A presence. Not outside. Not on the roof. But inside the RV with me. The grinning reflection. I told myself not to look in the mirror. I knew what I'd see. But I couldn't stop myself. My eyes flicked up, and my reflection was smiling. Not a normal smile. Not my smile. It stretched too wide, its teeth too sharp, its eyes too empty. It wasn't me. I slammed on the brakes. The RV skidded, the tires screeching against the dirt road. I turned around fully, knife in hand. But there was nothing there. Just the empty space where my reflection should have been. The road that led backwards. I had to get out of here. I threw the RV into reverse, backing up fast, trying to find another road, another way out. Then, the headlights washed over a sign on the side of the road. A sign I had passed hours ago. Welcome to Cedar Pines Campground. I slammed the brakes again. I was back where I started. That was impossible. I had been driving for hours. I should have reached the highway by now. But I hadn't, because the road wouldn't let me leave. The knocking begins again. A tap. 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 From the roof. My breath froze in my chest. The RV creaked as weight shifted above me. The thing hadn't been chasing me. It had been waiting for me to come back. The laugh came next. Low. Wet. Chittering. The same sound I'd heard the first night. Like this was all one big joke. Then, click. 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 The sound of claws scraping metal. I squeezed my eyes shut. I was trapped. There was no leaving this place. The moment I looked up, it would all be over. The final choice. I had two options. Stay inside and let it in. Or, I took a deep breath. Then, I grabbed the knife and threw open the door. I stepped out into the night. I looked up, and there it was, the grinning thing on the roof. It tilted its head, clicking its teeth together, watching me, waiting for me to run. I didn't. Instead, I smiled back. For the first time, its grin faltered, just for a second. Then, the world blinked. The morning that shouldn't exist. I woke up in the driver's seat. The sun was rising. The trees looked normal. The air smelled like damp earth, the sky turning soft shades of pink and orange. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine started instantly. I hit the gas, driving without hesitation. No looping roads. No strange whispers. No knocking on the roof. I drove until I reached a gas station, pulling in beside an old pickup truck. I got out, heart still hammering. I was out. I was free. Wasn't I? The final whisper. I walked into the station, grabbed a bottle of water, and made my way to the counter. The cashier barely looked at me. Long night, he muttered, scanning my drink. I let out a breathless laugh. You have no idea. I handed him a crumpled 20. But when he took it, his grip tightened. And then, he smiled. Too wide. Too sharp. You came back, he whispered. Then, somewhere outside, I heard a knock on the RV roof.